Today we'll do a demonstration of how to write response 3, which is an annotated source, or annotations of up to 3 of your research sources that you will be using for essay 3. Apologies, I don't have time to write the subtitles for this particular video. Today we're going to be looking at one of Keilla's sources. So in our classwork, in Google Classroom, we will scroll down to our responses, which is response 3, and click on the view instructions. From here, I will create a new Google Doc. And in here, I'll get rid of the tab if I can, change the spacing to double space as usual. And then I'll put in Keilla's name, the class name, and the title of the assignment, response 3, which is due this Friday, 14 March 2025. This does not need a title, so we're going to go straight into the first element that is required, one of the 4 elements, which is the MLA9 works cited entry. And I know this is a little mysterious and it can be a little complicated, but we'll try to demystify it as much as possible. So we'll be using one of Keilla's sources, which is a scholarly article that she found in a database in the library called Opposing Viewpoints. And it's called A Game Factors Approach to Cognitive Benefits from Video Game Training, a Meta-Analysis. This is focusing on Keilla's topic where she is examining the impacts of video games on players and the kinds of benefits or disadvantages that it may bring. This particular article has 2 authors, so Keilla will have to list both whenever he cites them in her body paragraphs. It has about 9,400 words, which is a good length, a little bit on the long side, but she can handle that. So the first thing we'll do is check the citation button, which is very useful in the library databases. And it's already set to MLA 9th edition. And if Keilla wants, you can simply copy this whole thing to her clipboard and then insert it here, except she doesn't have the hanging indent yet. So we're going to just insert with the shift key. We're pasting with the shift key. And now we have the entire citation built in. We will have to tweak it a little as far as indentation and italics, but otherwise and the hyperlink, but otherwise it has all the information needed for works cited entry. So to create the hanging indent, there are 2 ways to do this. One is by clicking on the Format drop-down menu in Google Docs. We will scroll down to Align and Indent, and then scroll all the way down to Indentation option. And under Special Indent here, where it says None, we will switch this to Hanging, and then we'll enter 0.5 and apply it. Okay, the other way to do it, which is a little bit simpler and especially takes less time, is in the ruler up here, we're going to click and drag the indentation markers over to 0.5, so 0.5 inch. Then I'm going to click and drag the top indentation marker back to 0. And now I have a hanging indent where we see the last name of the first author sticking out. This is to make things a little bit easier for you as a writer when you are writing your body paragraphs. You will pay attention mostly to this word here that's sticking out to the left margin. In Keilla's case, she will have to use Smith and Basak or Basak in her in-text citations to give credit to both authors. The next step, we're going to italicize two containers for this particular source. So the first container is the journal in which this article was published, which is PLOS1, which means basically Public Library of Science 1. So they've abbreviated it for us, which is nice. So this first container, because it contains a journal contains a lot of shorter and smaller articles, will be put into italics. So we can do that by clicking on Control I or Command I, or just clicking on a slanty I here in Google Docs. So it contains the volume, the number, the date it was published, and the page. Although in this case, because it's a digitally published article, there really isn't a page number. Those page numbers are more useful for print versions. So the second container that we're going to italicize is the database, because that too is a big collection of a variety of sources, including journals like PLOS1. So again, we're going to italicize this. The last thing we'll check with the citation is the hyperlink here. So we're going to select the URL, and you can hyperlink this by clicking on the link button here, or you can press Control K or Command K. Okay, now we have our hyperlink. So we have our works cited. We're going back to our regular left-hand indentation. So I'm going to get rid of this hanging indent and put the markers back to 0. And we're going to start with our first paragraph, which is the summary paragraph, in which we have to list the full names of all the authors, the full title of the source, and the thesis or the main point of the source. So as we can tell from the citation, we have two authors here. So we will put an indent and we'll say the article, and we'll type in the whole title, Game Factors Approach to Cognitive Benefits from Video Game Training, colon, a meta-analysis. So the title is contained in double quote marks. There are no italics yet because it's not a container. It's just a single by itself standalone source. Okay? And we'll say by, we'll take away the period, by Evan T. Smith and Chandra Malika Desak focuses on. Okay, so now we're going to look at the article in question. So the way Keilla can do this, especially when she's reviewing her sources to decide which ones she's going to keep to use for her essay, is to look through the abstract. And the abstract is like a summary of the article. We are not quoting from this abstract in your essay. Okay? You have to quote from the actual article itself. But here we see like the studies and meta-analysis. So it's actually looking or it's reviewing the literature on specifically on video game-based cognitive interventions. So if Keilla wants to use this source to show how playing video games or certain kinds of video games results in certain advantages in cognitive skills, then she can use this. So she may say, okay, I want to use this source because it focuses only on the kinds of advantages that playing certain video games like action, or let's say specific gameplay features. Okay, so there are specific ones. So the genre labels of action, strategy, casual, non-casual are not similarly predictive of outcomes. So there are certain kinds of games, genres of games that can result in improvements in cognition skills, but not all of them, or not all kinds of players, let's say. Okay, so this will give you a hint as to what the focus of or the thesis of your source will be, especially with very long scholarly articles like this one. So the other place to find it is in the introduction, and they are focusing mostly on strategy games rather than action or, let's say, games that um, may be a little bit different. Casual games are sparse, so they're talking about the literature. So, this is their thesis basically. If we assume that different gameplay factors reflect different cognitive demands, then these different games should be reclassified in terms of gameplay factors, not existing genres of action and strategy. Uh, so, so they're talking about the differing cognitive demands evoked by gameplay factors. So depending on the factors within the game itself, rather than the genre in which it's categorized, you're going to get different kinds of results, cognitive results. So the aim of the meta-analysis is therefore to disambiguate or clarify the findings of the extant BGT literature by examining the specific gameplay features of the games used for training. So that's their focus for this. So they don't want inconsistency regarding cognitive benefits. They want to clarify what types of gameplay factors tie into the kinds of cognitive benefits. So we'll put that in our thesis here. Focuses on clarifying the specific correlation, let's say, between the gameplay factors, not genres, um, and cognitive benefit. Okay, so that's what we're saying is our thesis for this particular article. Um, Google is suggesting focus. This is wrong, so I'm going to ignore it. Okay, so now that I have the thesis in, the next thing I have to do, or that Keilla has to do, is to look over 2 to 4 main points and the evidence used. Then she has to end with the takeaway message. And she has to do this without quoting from the source. In other words, she has to read through the source and decide on her own what she thinks are the main points in their source, in their argument, and then what kinds of evidence they've used. So the way she does this, because she doesn't want to read through everything, this is like 9,400 words about. So she doesn't really need to look at the literature search, the methodology of the source. She doesn't need to look at the data analysis exactly, unless she's really interested in statistics. But what she does want to focus on are the results and the assessment of publication bias, maybe, or more importantly, maybe the effects of participant and study quality factors on cognition. And then, of course, effects of currently used genre distinctions on overall condition. And then the effects of gameplay factors on overall cognition. So and then she may want to skip down to overall effectiveness of video game training, which is where the authors will bring together all of the information that they have sifted through and analyzed to present their final findings. She really might just want to look at discussion here. And the same thing goes for pretty much any scholarly article that you may want to use as a basis for your research. So if we look at the overall effectiveness, we shall see that overall cognitive interventions using video games are effective at producing training gains. So there is a general improvement in cognitive skills. Um, and however, they emphasize that significant evidence of publication bias was found in this body of work. So when they looked at the 63 other studies that were examining how video games promoted certain kinds of cognitive improvements, there was bias there. So they've corrected for publication bias, but they say you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at the results. So Kayla will have to remember that although overall there are improvements in how you think and your skills in thinking from video game training, um, this may be also a result of bias from the publications as well as the authors of those studies. So the selection bias was was apparent with the games used as training or the cognitive assessment. So how they use the games or which games they use and how they measure the results is also biased. So so they've considered this. So they're saying still shows a significant and moderate effect on cognitive improvements. So there's still a significant improvement. So gameplay factors, though, they were looking at those particularly. So they say with regards to overall cognition, the present meta-analysis found that both perspective and movement style significantly influenced training outcomes. Training with game featuring a first-person perspective demonstrated greater cognitive transfer than those featuring a third-person perspective. And games featuring an allocentric movement demonstrated greater cognitive transfer than those featuring egocentric movement. So this means that what Kayla can say, her first point is overall, the authors found significant, well, we can't say significant because that's used in the source. So we can say um, a definite, um, let's say, benefit in terms of cognitive skills uh, when video games were used for training. Although the authors note there there is a bias, let's say, in both the publications of the journals that publish the articles and the ways in which the studies were conducted. Um, then we can talk about the gameplay factors. So we can specifically say the authors discovered that there are certain kinds of games perspective influence the the improvements or advantages or benefits to cognitive skills. Um, Also, there seems to be action games that are specified are contribute to, let's say, attention, improvements in attention and perception. And then if you were using, let's say, games featuring allocentric movement compared to egocentric movement, um, primary combat interaction, and only a single controllable object compared to multiple. So a higher order means that you're using different kinds of analysis or cognitive skills in becoming more successful, let's say. So so let's say gameplay features which have been commonly theorized to drive transfer to higher order cognitive functions, such as reasoning and working memory, were not indicated to be particularly efficacious by the results of this meta-analysis. So, in other words, although some sources or other research studies may um, hypothesize that you can improve or game players can improve their reasoning or logical reasoning, let's say, and working memory in order to like um, remember strategies or the layout of a particular landscape or dealing with a particular challenge in the game is not apparent. Okay, so they're saying it's not really there, um, but in combat games, they're much more effective in producing transfer to the HC construct. So, so the higher order cognition construct, that's what they mean. So it's interesting that the presence or absence of combat as a primary interaction and the presence or absence of time pressure were correlated to a significant degree in the sample of studies examined. So if Keilla wants, she can talk about any of these particular points as long as she provides the evidence that is there. So let's talk, we can talk about memory and psychosocial. They were not in order to observe the impact and was not found to reliably transfer. So we can say that 2 points here. So in their review of studies, the authors found that while there is a higher um, outcome of improvement for combat, let's say games involving combat and time, let's say time limitations. Um, there was no evidence of improvement for memory. And what was the other one? For memory, psychosocial outcomes, psychosocial meaning how hmm, how this relates to their social activities. Uh, so we could say we can just say working memory. I don't think working memory was addressed. So memory. So we could actually say working memory here uh, in attention and perception, or in specific gameplay. So let's see, where was that part about working memory? Transfer, action. So games featuring multiple controllable objects produce greater transfer to attention and perception outcome measures. So we could talk instead about attention and perception outcomes. So, which is unusual. Um, there was, let's say, more evidence, more evidence of improvement for attention, um, and perception. There is no other way to really say that. Attention and perception outcomes. So, like identifying and dispatching threats, basically. So, we'll say, like, um, for skills that are required to categorize um, game features, not game features, but game factors. So we can say items, um, NCOs, or let's say characters to and respond to them appropriately, known as perception, attention and perception. Okay. Then we need one more to talk about um, anything else that these two authors can find. So the relevance of existing genre definitions, recommendations. Here's where they're winding up. So they were saying long form versus casual game distinction likewise appears to have little relevance. So uh, there are the genres are not quite as accurate as a way of analyzing game factors because action versus strategy or first person shooter versus real time strategy is not as feasible, let's say, to determining exactly how they will impact players' cognitive skills. Um, so we can end with that at the end. We can say the authors also comment that current genre generic terms for types of games like action or strategy are not very useful for, let's say, analyzing how the player's cognitive skills are impacted by the games. They end with, and so they have future recommendations. So they talk about the role and then their references, their sources. But here's their future. So they say further development, thoroughly research classification systems to describe the specific gameplay demands of VGT interventions, and particularly those how how those gameplay demands relate to cognitive demands would serve as a boon to future video game related. So they say that we actually need more studies uh, with a recommendation um, for more studies and research specifying, or let's say focusing on gameplay factors influence cognitive skills. Okay, so the first paragraph, your summary, will probably be the longest paragraph. So right now we have, let's see, 175 words already, which is actually a good size. You want that first paragraph to be around 180 to 250 words. Okay, so because you want to make sure that you have covered all of the details in the article or the source. And Kayla's next paragraph will be her evaluation. So this is where she decides, does this source look reliable? Do I agree, disagree, or both with any of these points? The trick is she can only refer to this particular source. You cannot compare it to others. She cannot go off on her own opinion, which is unsupported. And she has to stick to the evidence that she has actually discussed in her summary paragraph. Okay? So this is where it gets a little bit tricky for Kayla. So she can add in this source seems to be reliable since it discusses um, the current research on how video games may provide certain thinking, let's say, benefits or advantages in, um, let's say, thinking skills for gamers. Um, the source, the authors acknowledge that there is bias in the research they have reviewed, um, and they point out specific trends, or let's say specifics, specifics in their discussion, or let's say in their analysis of different factors of the research conducted. Okay. So in other words, the articles, they review them and they look at all the different kinds of articles and the way they conduct the articles, as well as the information contained in those articles uh, and the research. And they look at the connections or the correlations between different kinds of gains or advantages in different kinds of cognitive skills. Um, so Kayla can go on to give specific examples. She can actually quote. So she can say, for example, they note that, and then she can put in a quote. Okay? There is no page number here, and she doesn't have to say their names again because he has already provided their names. But what she does have to do is add um, discussion to uh, this quote. Like, how does this quote show how the quote or the source um, provides analysis? Okay. Her last paragraph, the third paragraph, will be the use of her source. So, how will she use this particular source? So, she will say, I can use this source in my body paragraphs that discuss specific advantages to playing video games. Um, it is also useful to show how there is bias, or there is possible bias in other research conducted to demonstrate um, benefits or harms of video games. And then she will end with her takeaway. And she could also say if she thinks there is a problem with the source or a limitation with the source, like maybe it is published too long ago, although this one seems to be fairly recent. It came out in 2023, which means the research was conducted probably in the early 2020s. So that's fairly recent. So she can say the source is fairly recent and covers most kinds of video games that are played today. Um, and it acknowledges uh, the limitations of their research. Okay. Then she can say, overall, I think this is a useful source. And then she will have her word count for everything, all three paragraphs, not including the works cited entries. So we're going to select everything from the top, and we see it's 320 words, which is within the recommended range. And then that's it.